let's get right into making my frozen maple walnut torte. Now, I love sharing frozen dessert recipes, and I know over the series of live streams, many of you have asked for ice cream and frozen dessert recipes. What I particularly love about this dessert is it's an elegant torte, a layer cake of meringue and maple semifreddo with maple toasted walnuts. The joy is you do not need to have an ice cream maker to make this frozen dessert recipe, and I think that makes it pretty special. So I talked about the three main components. We've got meringue layers that make the cake. We've got a maple semifreddo cream that is the ice cream component of it. And we're gonna start with that added touch of the maple walnuts. Now here in Canada, maple walnut ice cream is a very popular flavor. And so first off, I've got my 125 grams or a cup and a half of whole walnuts. These are untoasted at the time. And Cherry, you were asking about storing nuts too. So without candy, you can store nuts in an airtight container on the counter for about 3 months. And I find tender nuts or oily nuts like walnuts and pecans will turn rancid faster than hard nuts like almonds or hazelnuts. When in doubt, you can freeze them and they will freeze 6 months to a year. Now, to this 125 grams of walnuts, I'm going to pour in a 1/4 cup of maple syrup. And that allows me to tackle the very first question that I know some of you had written in advance, and I really appreciate getting your questions in advance so I can actually prepare and do some work finding information if I need to. But a common request from everyone, and on this thread now, is what to use in place of maple syrup. Maple syrup is a common ingredient in Canada. It's very popular. It is not inexpensive here either. I know it's very expensive in other parts of the world, but it is not a cheap ingredient here. So we value it and treasure it ourselves. But if you just simply don't have access to maple syrup, you have alternatives. Honey is a great one-to-one substitution. Now, honey, of course, has its own flavor intensity and flavor profile, so keep that in mind that you will have then a honey walnut frozen torte instead of a maple one. Corn syrup is probably your most affordable replacement, and that too is a one-to-one replacement in that recipe. You'll get the beautiful sweetness, you'll get the caramel notes that maple syrup has. Another option, if you prefer, is to use an actual maple syrup flavored syrup. So the maple, it is actually corn syrup, but it has the maple flavoring added to it. So it tends to be about half or a third the price of maple syrup. So those are three great options. And if you're just joining now, or I will repeat it again as I use maple syrup throughout the demonstration. So I'm just gonna put the maple syrup covered walnuts they fit onto a pie plate. You can put them on a baking tray, but you want to keep them in a single layer if you can. And the reason for this is you can see, and we've got, look at that new camera angle we have. Yay, Michael! You can see the pool of maple syrup here. And if you're using corn syrup and honey, you will see the same thing happen. The nuts are going to toast. The maple syrup is going to caramelize and candy the nuts and stick on the surface, but this little pool of maple syrup will also caramelize, and once it cools, it will crisp up like caramelized sugar and add a beautiful crunch, the combination of the syrup with the nuts. And this is whether you're using honey or corn syrup as well, will add a beautiful crunch texture to this torte. Do keep in mind that honey tends to not caramelize as quickly as maple syrup. So where this takes about 15 minutes in a 350 oven, that's 180 Celsius, you may find with honey, reduce the oven temperature to 160 and then let the nuts cook an additional 5 to 10 minutes to allow that honey to really caramelize on. So I'm going to pop these in the oven. And then I'd like to actually show you, I have my oven at a lower temperature because I'm thinking of the meringues right now. But of course, I have some done and cooled so that I can show you the consistency of these nuts. Like you can really even hear that rattle, rattle, that maple syrup caramelized on the outside of the nuts. Now, Cherry, asked an excellent, excellent question. Cherry asked about storing the nuts after they've been candied. And especially, Cherry, I know you live in the Philippines. Humidity is really a factor, isn't it? And so an airtight container is key. If you ever get electronics shipped to you, quite often you'll see they're packed with little silicone packets like this. These pull moisture away from the ambient atmosphere. So you can put, as it says clearly on it, do not eat, but you can put this near your nuts in an airtight container and it'll help keep them crisper longer. I don't, honestly, regardless of any climate, I don't recommend freezing the candied nuts because frozen for a long time, they'll stay intact frozen, but once they thaw, that sugar will liquefy and then they become sticky. Now, that will keep the nuts longer and you can fix it. So you can take those nuts that you did, candied nuts that you froze, they come out of the oven, they're a little bit tacky. You can pop them back in the oven for just another 5 to 10 minutes at 180 Celsius or 350 Fahrenheit, and that will re-crisp them for using right away. So I hope that gives you some options at least to work with. And I'm going to take a moment just to get myself ready to roughly chop these nuts. I'll be honest, when I'm candying nuts like this, I always do a few extra because they're great to have on hand to sprinkle on top of simple desserts. If you're just serving ice cream on its own, not making this torte, on top of a salad, or even grilled vegetables. This time of year, we're grilling a lot of eggplant and zucchini, and they can be delicious sprinkled right on top. One of our favorite salads to make is actually raw zucchini, the sprinkle of lemon juice, a little drizzle of olive oil, fresh mint, fresh basil, and then a sprinkling of toasted almonds or a candied nut like this, and it's absolutely delicious. And the finishing touch against the sweetness, a little Parmesan cheese. You just use a vegetable peeler. So there's your bonus recipe, completely different. A salad to balance out your dessert. All right, so now I've got my chopped nuts. I'm gonna move these out of the way and we can start on the meringue layers for this frozen maple walnut torte. I've got my 4 eggs at room temperature because it's more than just that you get a good volume from room temperature eggs. You can get a good volume from cold eggs. This is something I've been actually spending some time researching. But the true impact from whipping room temperature egg whites when you're making a meringue is so that your sugar can dissolve quickly into the egg whites so that you get a better whip to it. The sugar in making a meringue gives your meringue structure and solidity to it. So if you add the sugar to the cold egg whites, it won't dissolve, and you'll find you'll have a gritty and grainy meringue that will have more of a tendency to crack when you bake it. So I hope that gives you some great information. And while I'm separating the eggs, Jacob asked a question before we started the live stream about what to do with all the unused egg yolks when you separate the eggs. And this is always a challenge in a professional kitchen. I was pastry chef of a restaurant for a number of years, and when you design a menu, you actually have to create balance so that if you have a recipe that leans heavily on egg whites, like this one, or a pavlova, you have to have a dessert that uses the yolks. And creme brulee is probably one of the most famous uses for a large quantity of egg yolks. Another great thing you can make, and a video that you'll find right here on the OEM channel, is a pastry cream. And especially now that it's fruit season, strawberries, raspberries, cherries, if you're making cakes with fruit or tarts with fruit, to have a pastry cream on hand makes use of the egg yolks. The pastry cream, once cooked, can be frozen and thawed. You can freeze egg yolks if you're not using them right away. What you want to do is stir in I have 4 yolks here, stir in about a teaspoon of granulated sugar to combine them and then put them in the freezer. And that way when they thaw, remember I was talking about sugar liquefying, it will help make your egg yolks stay nice and soft so they can be used right away. So I will do that with these yolks, or maybe I'll decide to make a pastry cream later. Now, I don't need to add anything to the egg whites because of the quantity of sugar. As I mentioned, that will help promote a great volume to my meringues. And so this is a traditional French meringue, which means 50 grams of sugar for every large egg white. And I am splitting that. So I have 200 grams of sugar total, but I have 100 grams of granulated sugar. And to really build on that caramel flavor that maple has, I'm using 100 grams of light brown sugar. And before I start whipping, because I know the mixer makes some noise, someone had been asking about packed brown sugar versus normal. Tweens 101 was asking about this. Now, in the North American measuring world, a lot of people still measure by volume. And so to specify, to get that right amount of brown sugar, that's why you see my recipes call for half a cup of packed brown sugar, because I want you to pack it into the volume measuring cup, not have it loose. If you're weighing it, by, which is actually the preferred an easier way to measure, it saves on dishes. 100 grams, it doesn't matter if it's packed or unpacked, 100 grams is 100 grams. So half a cup packed is the same as 100 grams. So I'll start mixing my egg whites, and then once they're foamy, I want to reach a stiff peak. I will slowly pour in that sugar, giving it a chance to dissolve into the whites as it's mixing. Then at the very end, once I hit a stiff peak, then I'll add the brown sugar. And I actually don't want that to fully melt into the meringue because I want it to liquefy, but that's going to create more of a crust or a crunch in these meringue layers, which will stand up to the freezing when I assemble the frozen torte. So I'll start mixing right now. I'll take a peek at how everybody's doing on the thread here. Oh, great question. Lisha's asking, about TJ, how long he's been working. TJ, how long have we worked together? I guess it's been about 4 years now. I feel that way. Everybody's chatting with TJ. Okay, people are having trouble hearing. We're going to see if we can increase the audio. Well, now the mixer's going, so hopefully you can hear that and me just fine. Jules, you are not too late. I am making a frozen maple walnut torte. I made the maple walnuts. We're making the meringue. I'm going to pour in my sugar as the mixer's going. And now we're going to let this reach a stiff peak. And we're getting close to 200 likes. You know I always have to drive that challenge. I love breaking our 100 marks as we go through. So if you're just joining us, hit like. We want to crack 200. And I want to take a moment to check on the whites. And you probably hear that sound while the mixer's not going. We've got the lawn being cut next door. So neighbors are taking care of a sunny day. Now you can see right now that the meringue is actually still dripping off of the beater. So we're not at a stiff peak yet, but notice I'm not adding this 100 grams of brown sugar yet. Ooh, Brenda, you just asked an excellent question. What do overbeaten egg whites look like? Egg whites will be overbeat quickly, especially when they don't have sugar, so you have to pay attention. But overbeaten egg whites all of a sudden lose their smooth consistency and they start looking rough and craggy, and they will lose their gloss too. When you add as much sugar as I'm adding to the meringues today, you actually have less of a risk. It's really hard to overwhip egg whites with this much sugar in it. But if you're making whites for a souffle and you're not adding sugar to it, it can definitely take a little longer. Now, I hope everyone is clearly hearing me over the mixer, because I'd like to talk for a second while I continue to whip, because we're not at a stiff peak, about sugar alternatives when it comes to making a meringue. I had someone asking me that could they add maple syrup to the meringue? And the answer is you can, but not in just right from measured into the pot. you actually have to cook down the maple syrup because it's got more of a water content to it, and you need to cook it to 240 Fahrenheit, thread stage, before you pour it into your meringue mixture, and then that gives structure. And it does bring up an interesting point because, as I've just mentioned, sugar lends structure to the meringue. So if you reduce the amount of sugar, you will find you get a meringue that doesn't crisp up in the oven as much. It's the sugar that's caramelizing, not the egg whites. The egg whites will continue to be soft. It's the sugar that caramelizes. I believe it was, well, Shadra had asked, and Anna Christine had asked, and Danny, you were asking about using a diabetic syrup. It depends what it is made of. I have found agave syrup from the cactus plant works wonderfully in the case of making meringues in terms of caramelizing and getting set structure and crispness. So that would be my preferred syrup. I wouldn't know specifically about other syrups. It depends on what those ingredients. So if there's agave in there, I think you would be okay. If you want to reduce the amount of sugar, be prepared that your meringues may not crisp up as much. And Danny, if you want to reduce the sugar, I wouldn't reduce it more than 50%. So you could do 100 grams instead of 200 grams, but be prepared that the meringue might not be as crisp, or it might collapse a little bit once it comes out of the oven. Just wanted to prepare you there. I've hit my stiff peak now, and so now you can see that the peak of the meringue isn't moving at all. It's holding its peak. So now I'm going to add the brown sugar and then finish folding it in by hand. So the mixer can still be on high speed. And when I was making my meringue layers for this demonstration, I added it all at once and half of it flew out of the mixer. So added it a little at a time. Little immediate advice. I'm just going to crumble that in. And because brown sugar is more coarse, it won't dissolve as quickly. Give it one last fire up. There we go. And it turns the meringue a slight pale, sort of beige color. I will be using the mixer again. Let me grab my spatula. And I can feel that, yes, there are some slight sugar crystals still in the meringue, and you actually want that for this particular recipe. Now, Maria Teresa had asked, well, is this a dacquoise? Technically, it's not a dacquoise, because a dacquoise is a meringue like this, but it has ground nuts stirred into it. I'm working nuts into the recipe, but they're going into the cream filling, not into the meringue. So I would simply call these meringue layers, not dacquoise. And so just to point out what I have here, I have 2 baking trays lined with parchment, and I traced an 8-inch circle, 20 centimeters, onto the underside of the parchment. We don't want the magic marker ending up on our meringue. And while it might be tempting to measure your meringue in a measuring cup and then spoon out exact amounts, the more you handle the meringue, the more it's going to deflate. So I prefer to just eyeball it, and as you're spreading it, you can see proportionately when you have more meringue or less meringue on one layer or the other. These spend an hour in the oven, so even if one is slightly larger than the other, it really does even out. Set that out of the way, and you want to take your offset spatula and just start from the center. This is why I dolloped right in the center of each circle and spread. All we're doing right now is coloring inside the lines. So it's got a softness now. It did soften when I added that bit of brown sugar. It went from a stiff peak almost more to a medium peak, which is okay because these will expand. The meringue layers will expand. I'm just getting meringue off my hands. As they bake, we've got a nice angle there. Thank you, Michael. We don't have a set date for our next live stream. Michael goes back to teaching at Niagara College, teaching our next generation of chefs, well, we're kind of doing that together today, aren't we? So we have to figure out dates and times that'll work for everybody's schedule. So we will get back to you on that. And how are we doing on our likes? Oh, man, 261, that is awesome. So please, don't forget, if you've just joined me, just go on and click like, because I know you're going to like what you continue to see here as I assemble my frozen maple walnut torte. And it's okay that there's no maple in this meringue layer. So if you're using honey or corn syrup for the nuts and for the cream, you will be absolutely fine doing this recipe as it is. And in case you haven't noticed, and I'm sure you've subscribed to the channel, so you've seen all these recipes, the complete recipes follow underneath the screen. So you can follow along, you can go back and revisit this video if you have to sign off, because I know if you're watching from Philippines or Malaysia, it's kind of late right now. So if you don't make it through the whole video, you can go back and play it again later. And here we go. We are set to put these in the oven. So I've preheated it to 275 Fahrenheit. And forgive me, I can't recall the Celsius off the top of my head, but it's down in the recipe there. This is a really low oven. So we're less concerned about preserving the light color of the meringue. If I were making a pavlova that is presented, that you see the dessert. 135. Thank you, Michael. 135 Celsius for your oven. So a low temperature oven. We want to crisp the outside. The inside, because of that brown sugar in there and the weight of it, may be a little soft, and that is absolutely okay. But you want the crispness on the outside, but a little bit of browning is okay because we're dealing with maple, or if you're using honey or corn syrup instead, you want that hint of caramel flavor. So to have the outside of the meringues brown a little bit is 100% okay. So that's why when True Lies asked, what is the difficulty level out of a range of 1 to 10 of this recipe, I would give it a 3, 4 maximum. And I would only give it a 4 because you have to make the meringue and whip it to a peak. But as a frozen dessert, no ice cream maker, no fussiness with baking the meringues, and I think that keeps this recipe simple, but yet it's phenomenal and delicious at the same time. Now, I'm gonna have to move my walnuts out of the way. I do have my oven at 275, 135 Celsius. And my oven's reading right. Now, because I have my walnuts cooking at a lower temperature, they haven't toasted and the maple hasn't caramelized yet. So I'm gonna pop them back in the oven with the meringues. And basically, I'll check the walnuts in about half an hour. The temperature difference is that low. The meringues will take a full hour. And the good news is, if you pull your meringues out of the oven, it's hard to tell them when they're still warm because they'll be fragile and still soft. So go back and check your meringues after about 15 minutes. And if you find they've crisped up, then you're fine to go. If you find there's any stickiness or tackiness to them, you can put them back in the oven to dry them out. Keep the oven at the same temperature. These I made yesterday, and had it been humid overnight, and I know Cherry, Hermione, you're watching from Greece, and it's 31 degrees, and it's probably very humid. And this weekend, actually, here in Canada is supposed to be humid. You may find overnight that you develop a little tackiness to it, and that's just the sugar from within the meringue rising to the surface. You can pop them in the oven just for 10 minutes just to dry out the surface again. So I'm just checking to see if we have any questions right now. Oh, CJ is asking a good question. If you don't have a convection oven, this is not a convection oven. And please, this is actually a great rule of thumb. All of my recipes are designed on a still oven temperature. So if you do have a convection oven with a fan, you want to reduce the temperature by 25 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius to balance out the heat that's circulated from the blowing fan. So I'm just going to set these aside. I wanted to show you, just so you can see from start to finish, that there is actually a little caramelization that happens. And I think, Hermione, you were asking about meringue, preventing meringues from cracking. When a meringue has a lot of sugar in it, that's that structure I was talking about. The meringues will expand and you will find you get a bit of cracking, and that's just the nature of a sweet meringue like this. If you're making a meringue to top a lemon meringue pie, it has less sugar in it, so it doesn't have that tendency to crack. So this one even has a few pieces, but this meringue will be slightly soft in the center. Just going to push this out of the way. So now it's amazing. We've toasted the nuts. We've made this complete meringue layer. Now it's time for the cream, the semifreddo, which means in Italian half frozen. And so this a semifreddo is more like a frozen mousse where an ice cream is churned. And so to talk about that for a second, when you make an ice cream, typically a custard is recommended. So use those egg yolks from making your meringues, and you would make a creme anglaise style custard, then enrich it with cream. And then the idea is when you put it into an ice cream maker, it does two things. It keeps the cream moving as it reduces the temperature. And what that does is ice crystals then become very small and the ice cream becomes aerated as you mix it. So that makes it fluffy, easy to scoop, it melts on the tip of your tongue, it's got great flavor. Where if you were to just simply freeze cream with sugar into it, unless it's a high amount of sugar, you would get large ice crystals in there and it would not scoop easily, it would chip away. But a semifreddo, you're adding the volume ahead of time. So that's why we're whipping cream, 2.5 cups. And this is why a semifreddo is more like a mousse. And so it doesn't freeze as firmly as an ice cream that you would scoop. But in the case of this assembled torte, you want that because you want to be able to cut clean slices. And that texture of the meringue will stay crisp, frozen on the outside, soft in the center because of the sugar. And then with the semifreddo consistency, you'll get an even cut when you cut slices of this torte. So I'll grab my cream, 2.5 cups, or 625 ml. And actually, talking about dairy, someone had asked, Michelle had asked about the percentage of, we call it whipping cream here in Canada. It is 35% milk fat. So that in Britain, you would probably call it double cream. So it has to be a minimum of 30% fat, or it won't be able to whip it. You can't whip anything under than 30%. If you're lucky enough to have 40% cream, well, that's just going to make it that much more decadent. So that's the range in that whipping cream. And this talking about percentages of milk fat, I want to address Sagi. I saw your question, or your comment that you've been making butter from scratch. And I think that is absolutely amazing. And I hope you're still with us, Sagi. And I hope I've pronounced your name correctly. Please do correct me if I haven't. But making butter from scratch is absolutely amazing. And you don't use a mixer with beaters. It actually turns out better in a food processor. So you don't need to aerate and then collapse the butter, but you actually want to agitate it so that the fat separates from the water in the cream. And then what you're left with at the end, after about, I don't know, how long does it take you? About 5 minutes to let the butter separate out. You have butter. Now, the second part of that step, if you're making butter from scratch, so you can take a liter of whipping cream, and now technically, so your maximum yield on butter from a liter of cream is what? It would be 350 grams, because your cream is 35% butterfat. So once you've separated, but what that means is you have to squeeze out every droplet of water from that butter. And how to do that is after you've made your butter, you take that mass of fat and you'll see there's water dripping out of it. Have a bowl of ice water handy, and then you have to immerse that butter in that and start squeezing and massaging the butter. And that pulls out a little excess liquid. Then what you can do is weigh that mass of butter. And then you'll know exactly what percentage your fat is. So if you've got anything above 350 grams means that amount is your percentage of water outside of the butter. and you calculate the percentage, and you'll know if your butter is 80%, 90%. It's really hard to hit 100%. Because you were asking of can you use that in baking, it depends. So long as you hit 80% butter fat of that butter, it's fine to use in your baking recipes. If it's any lower than that, then you want to use it just for spreading on your freshly made scones or toast or whatever you have on hand. So I just wanted to touch on that because I thought that was an excellent question to ask. Interesting. Deb is saying in Australia, 35% cream is called thickened cream. So that's great to know. I love learning all these terms around the world. And just as a reminder, because the most often asked question I've had about this recipe is coming from different countries, what can I use in place of maple syrup? In which case, a 1-to-1 measure of honey or corn syrup or maple flavored syrup will work just fine. So you can make this torte. And how are we doing on the likes? Oh, 320, we cracked 300. I'd love to see it get a little higher. Can we do it? Can we do it? Can we do it? Can you vote twice? Can you like it twice? If you can, please do. I guess I should like it. I haven't done that yet. There. Okay, I just added my vote. No, you can't vote twice. All right, here we go. I'm assembling the maple cream, which is very simple. I'm going to whip the cream, and I've got 160 ml, 2/3 of a cup of maple syrup, that after I've whipped the cream to a firm peak, I will fold in. I don't want to add it while I'm whipping because that volume would actually separate and break down the cream. So we're gonna whip it first. I'll pour in a little vanilla as I'm whipping, but I'll fold in the maple syrup at the end. And I'll take a pot. Good question. Alex is asking, does agave work or flower honey? Yes and yes. Is the answer to both those questions. A flower honey, like an orange blossom honey or a chestnut honey, would be delicious. We have access to blueberry honey here, but agave syrup works wonderfully when it comes to a baking alternative. I have made sponge cakes, where you have to whip the whole eggs with the agave syrup to get the volume, and I have had great success doing that. That's a great question. Bliss, you're asking, will pancake syrup do? Yes. Pancake syrup will work great. If your pancake syrup has butter flavor added to it, that's where I might actually just buy as neutral a one as you can find. If it's got maple flavor, I'm splashing whipped cream everywhere, so I'm just going to protect the mixer for a little bit. Do I have? Oh yeah, I've got it everywhere. This is a live stream, everyone. It's the real world. Good. Oh, and here's a question: is heavy cream the same? It depends on your country of origin. Check the butter fat. Regardless of how it's named, your butter fat should be a minimum of 30% up to 40%, and then you'll be fine with your cream. Okay, little cream everywhere. I didn't actually get around to adding the vanilla because I had the towel over it. And I saw a question pop up about stabilizing the cream. With this recipe, because we are not storing the cream in the fridge, but instead freezing it, that will lock the stability in place. So you don't have to stabilize it. If you were whipping cream for a recipe to serve cold or chilled but not frozen, you could add 1 tablespoon of skim milk powder to every 1 cup of cream you're whipping, and that gives you stability and structure for at least 24 hours. Now I just poured in some vanilla, and I'm going to add my maple syrup. That's a lot of maple syrup. So maple syrup is our first harvest of the year here in Canada, and it happens usually about mid-March. And you have to tap the maple trees when the sap just starts flowing, before the leaves or even blossoms are on the tree. And then that syrup has to be reduced by 20 times to concentrate the sweetness and flavor. It comes out clear, and once cooked down, it takes on that flavor. But maple syrup changes through the season. So early in the season, it's very light, and then when cooked down, it's light in color and mild in taste, and it actually registers lower on the glycemic index. So better for people who have to reduce their sugar for dietary reasons. Where the late season, close to when trees are starting to push their blossoms and leaves out, is stronger and more intense. It's not that the sugar content changes, but the actual flavor changes and develops. Kind of think of any fruit season. If you buy a strawberry, right now it's strawberry season here in Ontario. If you bought a strawberry 2 weeks ago when they just started, it might not have developed its full sugar flavor, might be a little pale in color, but right now it's peak season. They are a deep red, they are sweet, and then within a week or two from now, they're gonna be at the end of the season, they're gonna be heavy with sugar, and those are the ones I like to make strawberry jam from. Okay, so here we've got our maple cream, 3 simple elements, the meringue layers, the maple cream, and this will freeze. Because of that quantity of maple syrup, it's the sugar that helps prevent the cream from freezing rock hard. It keeps it soft. But I am gonna fold in all but a little sprinkling, about 3 tablespoons of the walnuts into the cream. So now we're building that crunch layer. And before the live stream started, someone was asking about other nut options. Pecans would make a delicious substitute. They're a nice tender nut like a walnut. If you were to use hazelnuts or almonds, I think you could do that very well. Just make sure you chop them a little more finely than you would walnuts or pecans because they're a firmer nut and you just don't want to get caught by surprise in the frozen dessert. Just clear my throat. All right, let's assemble. So the first thing is I've got my springform pan. I keep forgetting we have this overhead shot, Michael. It's so amazing. I've lined the bottom and the sides with parchment paper, and you can see the parchment paper is coming a little higher than the pan. That's in case my layers are just a little higher than the height of the pan. If you have acetate, you can use that on the sides of the pan. The difference is acetate is plastic. It will stay in place, where you might find that as the dessert freezes with the parchment, you get a little bit of buckling with the parchment paper. But this is it's a torte and it's fancy, but it's rustic looking at the same time. So we've got our meringue layer centered in the pan. So this is a 9-inch pan with the 8-inch layer. So that's why there's space around it. And then I want to spoon about 1/3 of the cream and just take a spatula and start, you can just use the spatula from your whipped cream and start spreading it around, and make sure you push it into, get some in the bottom of the pan so that it covers the sides of the dacquoise. And don't worry if, it's not dacquoise. The nuts are in the cream, not in the meringue. Don't worry if it starts cracking a little bit as you assemble, because once you've got that cream on there, everything's going to be frozen and it'll stay in place. And you can always fill in the gaps on the side a little bit with a little extra cream. Sometimes those nuts get in the way, so you just have to work around them. And you don't have to worry about this being too perfect because you're going to stack layers on top of them. And once you're finished, the meringue does compress a little bit. So now another 1/3 of the cream. Do I have enough? I've got to make sure I save enough for the top. Yeah, I'm good. So unlike a cake with a buttercream, this is not nearly as fussy. But what I like most, as I said at the top of this live stream, what I love most about this recipe is that you don't need fancy tools, yet it's a showy dessert, it's a frozen dessert. But if you have electric beaters, you can make this elegant dessert. So we've got the second layer, the last layer is now going on top. And I'm intentionally, my meringue was a little poofy on that side, so I'm intentionally flattening it out a little bit. Now the last of the cream goes on top. Okay, how's everyone doing? Oh, yep, questions about the maple syrup. So as a note, if you are looking for the light versus the dark, the early season maple syrup that is better for people who have to steer clear of too much sugar is called amber, light or amber, and that's the early season, where the dark is the late season syrup. And light and amber are the more common types anyhow. which is good. Bakers like to use the dark maple syrup because its flavor is more intense, so it transfers into desserts nicely. So as you can see, as I'm spreading this, the cream is kind of reaching the side of the parchment paper, filling in the gaps in between. And I don't fuss too much about a perfect top. You do want it to be level and as round as you can make it. Here we go. And then the finishing touch, before you put it in the freezer, just a sprinkling of those nuts. This is the pastry chef in me, because when I had bakeries for a number of years, you always want to leave a visual cue when a dessert has nuts in it in case someone has an allergy or sensitivity. It makes it clearly visible that there are nuts in contact with this recipe. So that's just my habit, but it's a lovely finish. Now you want to freeze this, and you have to give it overnight is best. But being a semi-freddo, half frozen, it doesn't take as long as ice cream to freeze. Now I'll just switch this out. Once again, I'll have happy neighbors who get dessert. And I'll pop this one in. And here is the torte I assembled yesterday, ready to come out of the pan. Don't lick the metal pan, of course. Ooh. And I'll bring over my cake stand. And you'll find because it's frozen, it's easy to peel away the parchment paper. And then peel away the paper from the sides. So you see what I mean. You get a little bit of a pucker, but it doesn't impact the shape of the torte itself. Oh, I love the look of it. Love, love, love the look of it. Let's get a knife and a spatula. So there it is, your frozen maple walnut torte. I'm just going to take a peek at any questions. I want to make sure before I cut a slice and start eating, I've handled everybody's question. Special K just asked, if you don't have a springform pan, what can you use? Well, you can use a regular cake pan because you're lining the bottom and the sides with parchment paper. To tip it out, you'll want to fully tip it upside down to remove the bottom of the pan. And if you drop in a spatula or a knife to loosen it, it should pop right out. So you can make this without using a springform pan. That was a very good question to ask. Oh, Atto, great. I love your observation. Simple yet elegant. That is what I try to do with so many of my desserts. I want you to feel confident that you can make this recipe, especially because, I mean, making a frozen cake can seem rather daunting, but I think what I've shown you is it is actually not overly complicated. And it slices so easily. So the give that as I push the knife through between the frozen semi-freddo and the meringue layers, I'm not feeling any difference. And then, just like the picture you saw on the screen, you can see that, and you tell me where my sweet spot is, Michael. Have I got it placed right? I want you to be able to see the meringue layers. You can see the light browning on the outside of the meringue layers, and then you've got that sort of maple tinted, the cream in between, and then you have the crunch of the candied walnuts in there. It is really something special. TJ, I'm with you. I think we have to hit 400 likes. We can hit 400 likes with this video. I know it. We're only 20 away. We can do it. Oh, this is a good question. Making alcohol-free vanilla extract. Now that is a very good question, and I know it is a concern. You do need, if you're making a liquid extract, the alcohol helps preserve the flavor and gives it a shelf life. What I would suggest you do to add vanilla flavor to your desserts is to buy the vanilla beans You can use the seeds for your recipe, but then what I actually do is I save all the beans themselves and I pack them into a container of sugar. And within 2 weeks, that sugar will take on a vanilla flavor. The more beans with the less sugar, you'll get a more concentrated sugar. So even just adding a tablespoon of that vanilla sugar can add the proper amount of vanilla flavor to your recipe. So I hope that answers your question, because that is a frequent one. Thank you for asking that. And oh, some lovely comments. And yes, I do have some happy neighbors. I'll have to run across the street though on a hot summer day. This torte will be melting soon enough. You'll probably see my comment at the very end that actually, to enjoy eating this dessert, I prefer to pull the torte out about 30 minutes. In this size, on an average day, you'll find that this won't melt or deflate because you put in all that volume quickly in advance before you froze it. And I find it's just a little more palatable if it has a chance to sit out. Of course, if it's a hot, humid summer day, I would go right from the freezer to the ta-da moment. Maybe there are birthday candles going on a slice or the cake. I'll leave that up to you. And let's give this a try. I think your questions have been amazing. I hope I covered everyone's. I'm just doing a little peek to see that I covered everyone's who asked ahead of time. Oh, Michelle was asking, could I use treacle? We talked about using honey. We talked about using corn syrup. I'm not as familiar with treacle. It's available here in Canada, but it's not as common as it is obviously in the UK. I think it's not as strong as molasses, if I have it correctly, but it's in that world of a golden syrup, maybe a little darker than a golden syrup. Perhaps you could do a 50-50 replacement. I wouldn't want the intensity, if it has a molasses flavor, to take over too much on the desserts. So I think that was the last of the questions that came up. And I'm just doing a last scan. TJ, thank you for moderating this thread. I've seen you weighing in and helping people out, and that's what our team effort is, between Michael running the cameras, me making the food, and TJ keeping you connected and keeping us connected. That is our goal here at Oh Yum. So we're constantly talking and planning about the next moves. We haven't determined the next live stream date, so make sure, if you haven't subscribed to this channel, that you subscribe now so you will get the notification of when the next live stream will be. It's not a matter of if, it is simply a matter of when. So in that time, my cake has softened up a little bit. I wish you a wonderful rest of the week, a fabulous weekend. If you've stayed up late from the other side of the planet, thank you so much. To all of you, thank you for giving me your time today. Enjoy making this frozen maple walnut torte. Cheers. Oh, the meringue just kind of disappears. And the semi-freddo is not icy. It's creamy, just like an ice cream, just that little bit softer. I am 100% confident you will enjoy this torte, even if you are making it with honey or corn syrup or flavored pancake syrup. You will absolutely love it.